I'm here today with Arielle Schwartz. As I've said right before we got on, I have been following your work for some time, really respect your perspective, and you've really dedicated your career to working with trauma in particular. And that is a tough job. It's certainly a tough job to sustain, especially these days. So can you just give us a quick background about yourself and how you got interested in this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I came into it for myself first. And I think that's true for so many of us as therapists, that we choose a field that resonates for what we need as well. And initially, I studied somatic psychology or body-centered psychotherapy. And I chose that route because I was the kind of person growing up that somaticized everything, held it in my body. I got sick a lot. There was an early divorce in my family. There was a kind of small T's or developmental trauma accumulation that I often refer to as the complex PTSD, because there's so many different contributing factors. So that certainly contributed to my early sense of self or lack of sense of self, even my own dissociation. And I didn't have language for all of that, but I knew that for me, that certain practices brought me back home to a felt experience, and that those practices were primarily body-centered or somatic. So whether it was going to a yoga class or in college, I got introduced to body-mind centering, and that those experiences were so formative and influential into who am I as a person, that I basically in the 1990s looked at, like, where can I get more of this? Where can I study this? And at that time, there were 3 programs, one of which is here in Boulder, Colorado, and it's how I landed here and went to Naropa University. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some
So,
friends there that love the place. Well,
yeah.
that's interesting. So early on, you were aware of your body and the absence of your body at times.
Yeah.
That's part of what centered you in your interest here. Like very much, you started out kind of bottom up.
Yeah, very much. And I didn't necessarily go to school to become a trauma therapist, but when you study somatic psychology, there's a certain way in which it just all makes sense. All roads lead to Rome, or at some level, all of the spokes of the wheel kind of come into this hub at the center. And for me, what was left unprocessed, which it's not like a one-time, one and done thing. This was many years of my own internal work. But what was left unprocessed from all of those early life experiences, and then go figure, we live a human life, and life experiences accumulate all along the way, especially in our complex world. I later had experienced several car accidents in my early 20s. And it was a chiropractor that originally suggested that I go try EMDR therapy. And my first experience as a client receiving EMDR therapy was absolutely one of those magic sessions. It was so phenomenal, and it connected all of these dots of my own internal processing, and it had the somatic element and it had a cognitive element, and it just resonated so deeply for me that I signed up for the training the next week. I was like, I want to do that. Yeah.
We do what works, like what
Yes.
we can feel that really works. And you've stuck with it, and specifically around
Mhm.
trauma. How do you hang in there? How do you resource yourself? What does
Mm.
this work give you?
There's a phrase that I came across several years ago that resonates so deeply for me because, first of all, I hit burnout at several points in my own process as learning how to do therapy and walk this line and take care of myself and not abandon myself and so forth. And I can share with you a little bit about what I think contributed to the burnout. But this phrase that I came across some years ago that really touched me was this term, vicarious resilience. We get taught so much about vicarious traumatization, and it's very real, and compassion fatigue, and it's very real. But if we also look at the impact of being a therapist focused on helping others overcome adversity, and what vicarious resilience refers to is the positive impact on helping professionals that comes along with the meaning that is in our work and with really seeing those positive shifts take place. And so I really turned my whole practice around, actually, even before I came across that phrase. But when I bumped up against burnout, a lot of that had to do with my own unprocessed trauma that was coming through the gates as I was working through others and realizing that there were pockets of my own history that were needing more attention. And I needed to attend to that. I needed to give that its full nurturance and therapeutic support within me. And also, I think it really was about a mindset shift in my work into what I call now resilience-informed therapy. And that's a strength-based approach, and it's really attuning to what's already working, what are the existing supports, and even what is the strength behind the symptom. What's the meaning behind the symptom, right? What was wise about dissociating, or what was wise about whatever coping habit one developed? And so that resilience informed lens really helped get out of that myopic, everything is trauma, into what's the broader field that's holding the person.
This is so great. I already am feeling good about this because it's so true. And this is part of why I
Yeah.
wanted to bring you on, is that as you look more and more about trauma and the effect on the brain and the body and the intergenerational aspects and all of those things, it can be very heavy and very hard. And then when we add this context that we're all living in,
Yeah.
that as therapists, we're catching people managing the stress of some of the national divide. Sometimes I think of it as that our leaders are our parents in a sense. When our parents, like this idea of trust, we can't
Right.
just play on the playground. We have to really keep an eye over here. Then what we're seeing is things that scare us and that
Yeah.
polarize us. And that's not a political statement at all. That's
Mhm.
just safety danger.
Yeah.
And so, with that context, being able to have a thread of, boy, how are we managing? How do we help therapists hold people that are experiencing it right now? Yet they're also in it. We're right in the middle of it. Where COVID is happening, shutdowns are happening, all of the things are happening together. So, this thread of hope that we'll be talking more about around a post-traumatic growth. I say I have to think to say it versus stress,
Right.
and peritraumatic growth.
Yeah.
It really is an actual change of mindset, and I
Yeah.
already can feel the hope of it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you just named something so important, which is that we as therapists have been trying to process what's been happening in our current world for the last 2.5 years alongside with our clients. And we might not even be a step ahead sometimes. I remember the week of the shutdown in 2020 of March 13th or whatever it was that week, and literally listening to the news saying this school district just shut down, that one just shut down, this state is responding this way, this is what's happening in this hospital. And hour by hour, right? We were all trying to keep up with the rapidity of what we were coming to realize was happening in our world. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And to be processing that and still sitting with our clients who are receiving the same information that quickly, not knowing what was going to happen in the next day.
Yeah, that's disrupting their
Whew.
treatment or changing their
Yeah.
treatment in some way. So there's also
Yes.
that, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then like switching to online and adapting to that. And we have just been right alongside. So to me, there's actually been something very touching about this as well, which is that it's really brought us all to the most human place. We are all humans trying to sort this out. And sometimes even our clients seeing us as humans responding to this right alongside. It's not always that we have all the answers and the expertise. And I think this really exposed that in a very good way, in an
Well,
important way.
yes, and it exposed it for us too. Around,
Yeah,
like I had this thing of there's not even someone I can consult with. There's not even a mentor that
right.
kind of knows how to guide managing some of these things. So yeah,
Yes.
we were thrown right into the deep end
Yeah.
along with everybody for sure.
One thing I will say that perhaps was one of the best teachers is actually coming from some of my yoga background, in that the yoga practice is so often about stepping into the unknown and embracing and not knowing what's going to come next, whether you call it yoga or whether you call it mindfulness, but that having any form of practice that allows us to sit with ambiguity became the ground in the groundlessness.
Love that, the ground and the groundlessness. Thinking in terms then of the growth and that we're in it, we're still in it. This isn't over. As a matter of fact, a lot of people would say it's getting worse, and there's
Mhm.
signs of increasing threat
Yeah.
politically and for many of us. So, this idea of, can you just tell us a little bit? What does peritraumatic growth mean? What is that
Yeah.
term?
I'll start with post-traumatic growth and then we'll work our way into peritraumatic
Sounds
growth.
great.
One of my favorite definitions of post-traumatic growth is really about our belief that we can work through hard stuff and come out with an increased sense of depth or understanding or wisdom or strength or whatever that gem on the other side. But it's not that necessarily the hard stuff makes us grow. It's what we do with it, how we metabolize it, how we process it, if you want to use that word, although we're not food processors, but what it is that we do with that difficult emotion, what support we reach toward, or what tools we have to not get stuck in it, but to actually move through that tunnel and come out the other side.
Yeah, because it's so easy to think in terms of that being an insulting idea or a head patting. Oh, this isn't as
Totally.
bad for you. There's a silver lining or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
Right,
exactly. It's that whole idea of bad things happen for a reason. That's
right.
not at all what this is about. It's we are human and we're going to face difficult events in this human life. And how do we cultivate the tools to help us deal with adversity? And what's really tricky, of course, is if you have had adversity in your childhood, if you've had childhood trauma and developmental trauma, is that as a child, our access to resources can be very limited. And so it's more likely that we have kind of pockets that we drop into or islands that we land on of despair, helplessness, powerlessness, hopelessness. And those are probably the biggest barriers to post traumatic growth.
Are the pockets themselves, you mean?
Is
Our
landing
historical
in that
pockets?
is landing in that self state, if you want to think about it that way, or parts language, landing in that part of self and not having access. Sometimes the metaphor I use is we've landed on this island of self and we don't have any ferries or bridges or flights off the island, that we get
Mm-hmm.
stuck in that island of despair.
And don't even know
Exactly.
how to ask for help, to ask for help. Don't
Exactly.
see competence, don't have that body experience of that relief that can come interpersonally on that island.
Yes. I'm just thinking of a clinical example for a moment of working with a woman who we had cultivated a list of resources. We even wrote them down. She had them in her purse. And of course, when she drops into that self state, the first thing that goes is she forgets to look at the list. It's knowing that we have an adult here now self that actually has a wider range of choices that were available to us when we were a child.
Yeah. Makes me think of internal working models and rewiring is a rewiring that has to happen to help that person remember
Yeah.
and have the experience of remembering and it working.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, the experience of remembering and it working.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have repeated experience of remembering and it working again and again to get that rewiring or that neuroplasticity of that new positive self state or the bridge built between the island of despair and the mainland.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then post traumatic growth, what else about that? Like, how is it misunderstood?
Yeah.
What are some of the surprises for you
Yeah.
in it?
Yeah. I want to link it back to this idea of peritraumatic growth, and we'll keep
Yeah.
unpacking what all of this is. But if we think about post traumatic growth, we often think, okay, the event is over. The car accident or the flood or the fire, right? I'm living in Boulder, Colorado, and we've had both of those recently. It's very fresh, very real. But so often we think, okay, there's this event and it ended, and now I can focus on metabolizing and processing that hard stuff and come out the other side. But what are we looking at when we're living in a world where there's 2.5 years of chronic exposure to experience of threat, right? And not knowing what's going to happen the next day, and whether gun violence and sending your kids off to school, or whether it's climate change and
Or being in a
fires and
parade, in a
floods.
July 4th parade. And,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. So peritraumatic growth is basically applying some of the same principles that we look at that facilitate post-traumatic growth or resilience and applying them in the midst of ongoing exposure to adversity and traumatic stress.
Okay, that's great. So I want to go more into that. One of the
Yeah.
things around like what causes PTSD are the affect and the associations and our response to the overwhelming event. So what you're saying is if we can resource during it, are there, just off the top of your head, are there particular things before we go into the growth that will set someone up to have more trouble because this is happening to us. One of the things with PTSD is there's often the experience of anger, disgust, sadness, and the core feelings that tend to come up. And you can see people having that where people are moving, people are wanting to burn buildings down, people are wanting to, so it's literally happening now.
Yeah. When you look at some of the research on resilience, some of the key factors that both either, if they're not there, can reduce our resilience to traumatic stress. And if they are there, of course, they promote our resilience. But one of the most important ones is about isolation. The more isolated or the fewer positive, predictable, consistent social sources of nourishment that we have, the greater the barrier to resilience and growth. So what was so challenging, and in some ways still is so challenging with our pandemic, of course, is that with quarantine, and especially for individuals who were living alone and didn't have family and didn't have other people in their immediate environment, the experience of isolation had such a profound negative impact on our resilience during this time.
And how does that cross with some of the attachment literature related to how people respond to stress?
Yeah. I mean, you even look at some of the kind of shared neurobiology or shared neurophysiology between social isolation and physical. So we know that it's the same parts of the brain that are lighting up when we feel disconnected from others or experience social loss and experience physical pain. And I believe that there's some research out there even about the contributing aspect of that to the worsening response to COVID, so that it's actually a risk factor of how you respond to the virus based on how much social connection you have.
Interesting. I've seen that, but it doesn't surprise me because it's associated with cardiac health and
exactly.
But also just is that because sometimes this idea of secure attachment has to do with having how is that different than resilience in a way?
Yeah, they're so deeply interconnected, aren't they? This idea that somehow I had that felt experience that I could reach out to another person and have a positive response. And so individuals who had the luxury or the privilege of secure attachment probably could handle the isolation of the pandemic with greater resilience because there's this knowing based on my experience in life that other people are trustworthy and that they'll respond in a positive way if I reach out and ask for connection or support. And if we don't have that, if we didn't get that in early childhood, again, if we look at that element of neuroplasticity, what we also recognize is that we can gain the benefits of earned or learned secure attachment throughout our lifespan. So that's where I think therapy often comes in, is that we can provide that predictable, consistent, caring, nurturing relationship for someone, even if they didn't get that in early childhood.
I think about when you're talking about the isolation, one of the things I noticed was it was hard to isolate and then we accommodate to it. And then it was hard to not isolate. Right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm still adjusting to the reopening, right? It's a little scary to go back out there.
But that's such a good felt experience, though, of if you've never had it, that you settle into, and this is the way we talk about it on the podcast, is like a colored continuum, and blue being on the when you had to zip up and just not even look for the help. So this really gives us a feel for how that ends up working, that it ends up actually being adaptive, but then sets us up. I think what we're saying here is that it sets us up to have a much more difficult time during the stress because we're not getting that regulation. Is that
That's
right?
right. We're not getting any co-regulation. And I think what, for some individuals, and I'm sure you found this as well, is they were like, oh, I love quarantine. Like they were just like, this is how I prefer to live. I actually am relieved that I don't have to go out there into the world. And so it's not necessarily that we want to put it all into one camp. I think for some attachment styles, it actually was a relief to some degree. But I think the challenge is that very often that self-reliant strategy that one had to develop as a child has a burden somewhere, right? To not be able to experience co-regulation with another person. At some point, there's this feeling of the only person I can rely upon is myself.
Totally.
And that's exhausting too.
Absolutely. And so then with the idea of the growth, that part of the growth is going to be something about, can you say more about how does that look during the event?
Right.
Yeah.
So if we can recognize that to some degree, isolating or becoming passive. So if we look at what are the risk factors or the barriers to resilience and growth, one would be isolation. Another one would be passivity, basically a loss of self-efficacy. No matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. So what's the point of trying? And so if we look at then what facilitates growth, right? It's this recognition that, okay, I might not be able to change the entire situation. There's a lot that I still don't have control over, but what do I have control over that creates a small positive shift in my hour or in my day or in my week? And so I often think about creating this list of those resilience practices that we can build in that optimize your felt experience of yourself and your sense of empowerment each and every day.
Yeah. And I imagine many of us are doing a few of those things, not even being aware of it. By you highlighting it, it's like beginning to really collect them and value them in a new way of
Yeah.
these are our handholds.
In the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook, I speak about the different types of resilience. Mental resilience, right? Like the ability to be flexible cognitively, right? To think about things in different manners, to not get stuck in one kind of negative looping experience. We have emotional resilience, which means that there's a capacity to be with our emotions, to recognize that there's health and vulnerability, that the ability to express what we're feeling actually facilitates congruence, and the body, mind love congruence, right? There's like our vagus nerve lights up with congruence and all of that good stuff. We have,
And
yeah.
congruence meaning specifically. Say a little bit more about
Oh,
that.
good. Yeah. No, I always appreciate
Yeah.
those cues, right? Congruence basically meaning that I am in tune with what I'm feeling. I'm in sync so that what is happening on the inside is actually being matched with what I'm expressing on the outside. And incongruence, if we want to look at the opposite, is I'm fine. And everyone's going, you're not fine. Like, you don't look fine. You don't sound fine. But when we're congruent, when we're saying, I feel really sad right now about what's happening, or I feel scared, even though it's a difficult emotion, there's actually something that goes, wow, I named what's true. And that's enough.
There's an integrity to it.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the person saying fine is not fine. Fine in general is not the best answer, just by the way, for you listeners. There's a cost to that. That's holding on.
Yes. And
Yeah.
there's a cost within ourselves. There's a personal cost and there's a social cost, right? I'll give an example that a friend of mine shared with me. He said that his grandson came up to him and he said, Grandpa, why are you so angry? And he said, I'm not angry. And his grandson said, tell that to your face. And what's beautiful about this story is, maybe I am. Let me check in with that. Like he received it. But how often does the child who's more right-brained see the emotion on the adult in their life, point it out or act it out, and the adult can't receive the message, can't own it, or go, So it's that incongruence, of course, that then creates these experiences of lack of safety interpersonally.
Right. Into the trauma part that I can't believe my lying eyes. Like I
Yeah,
can't that
right.
the experience then is to really have to split the knowing of what's happening with the external world, what it takes to get along in the world.
Exactly. And if that happens repeatedly in childhood, one has to adapt in all sorts of ways, either to cut off that knowing, cut off that intuiting part of oneself or that right-brained felt experience in order to comply or to belong socially. Or basically one has to adhere to my own truth, but I don't get the benefit of belonging and connection. So it creates a real dilemma. And going back to the kinds of resilience, so there's mental resilience, emotional resilience, there's social resilience, and even that knowing that another person is trustworthy or that there is someone that I can go towards or that I can be a trustworthy other for somebody else.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the
Yeah.
different domains of it.
There's two more.
Okay, great.
There's two more.
Please keep
Right.
going.
So there's physical resilience. And what we're speaking about there is basically being able to create a robustness of our bodies. And I also often tie in what I refer to as nervous system flexibility, which is that when you study polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve, we recognize that the vagus nerve, or what we call vagal tone or vagal efficiency, are the physiological markers of resilience.
Oh, that's a nice way to say that.
And then the fifth one is spiritual resilience.
So say that again, since I've interrupted,
Okay.
more in a list, right? Like
Yeah.
these different domains.
Yeah. So we've got that mental resilience or cognitive flexibility, emotional resilience or emotional intelligence, that ability to be with our feelings and to recognize that there's value in that congruent expression of what's happening inside. We have social resilience, which in some ways a outcome of those first two, in that ability to receive from others and also give to others in a meaningful way. And we have physical resilience and that nervous system component to that, of our autonomic nervous system being able to handle challenge and recover from challenge. And then spiritual resilience, which I often, think about in that category of meaning making. And how do I create a meaningful life, a purposeful life, one that feels fulfilling at that kind of deepest spiritual level? And whether spirituality is the right word for you or not, it's really about what's that big picture? What do you wake up in the morning and look forward to? What motivates you to walk through the world?
Kind of some of the existential questions.
Who am I?
Exactly. So then how do you work with those domains?
I think often what I look at is how are we feeding or nourishing those five categories and creating a very personalized answer to those questions. So if I want to cultivate more of that spiritual resilience, for example, what do I need to bring into my life, right? For me, it's cultivating a daily meditation practice. For me, it's spending time in nature and just being able to just get this really big step back from the myopic experience of the day-to-day stressors and tap into a beautiful sunset or whatever it is. What is it that allows you to tap into spiritual resilience, whether it's your yoga practice, whether it's going to church, right? Whatever that is, creating, I think, a lot of what Viktor Frankl speaks about in terms of tapping into our values, whether they're creative values or even mindset values, right? If I can create that mindful pause between stimulus and response, and how do I actually choose my actions in the world that are in alignment with my values?
That sounds great. I'm thinking of the complication with that too right now, around that things can be so overwhelming, that the existential questions, do you go in there, the guilt that many people have of looking away and turning off the news, the intentional dissociation, in a sense, like I can't, it's too much for me. And if it's not too much for me, then I get overwhelmed by it.
Yeah. To me, when I think about media exposure, whether that's social media or the news or listening to the radio, however it is that you're taking in really the constant information that we're all trying to process, for me, it's why I have those other practices. Then I know how much can I expose myself to the adversities that are around me in a way that actually I can still digest. Do I have those practices, whether that's, for me, I'm a therapist, whether that's going to supervision and consultation, whether that's going into my own therapy, whether that's sitting on my meditation cushion? Do I have the practices that allow me to digest what is happening in my current world? And I think that's, in a way, kind of ties in all of those five domains. Do I have the practices that allow me to navigate the inevitable challenges that are going to continue to happen?
I can't help but think about, as you're talking, that I'm on board. Totally sounds good. I like the categories because it helps you think of, wasn't even thinking of the physical or the whatever. So just if I can say back, part of the idea is that you're cultivating things that, that in post-traumatic growth, I think that there's a connection there, but we're pulling them in so that you're modulating now while it's happening during the stress. Yes. Is that right?
You got it.
I also think, and I don't know how this fits in, but around like class and culture, some of these things seem like such privileges to be able, even the idea of safety and to choose to engage or not to choose to engage, whereas that's not true for many people.
That's right.
And part of my next thought was, well, sitting on a mat and having these resources that is available to everyone. But I guess like the support for that, or the cultural support for that.
Trying to close some of those gaps in terms of access to resource has been a real passion of mine as well. And I know it's a shared passion. In fact, I was reading about just even how you're donating some of the profits of creating this work, right, as a way that provides you spiritual meaning. Like, I really get that. I relate to that deeply. And for me, one of my pandemic projects was to take what was always a very localized offering. So I've been teaching therapeutic yoga for trauma locally in one of our local yoga studios to a smaller, relatively smaller group of students that would come in and do these 6-week classes with me. And I knew the great benefit of these classes, and the pandemic hit and I wasn't able to teach yoga in person. So I took my classes online, both my general yoga classes and my therapeutic yoga, and I just combined the whole thing and made it available. Donation, a lot of those classes ended up also being donations to other causes during this whole time that we've been living through. And the meaning that came for me around creating an accessible trauma-informed yoga class and a YouTube channel around that, and made it free or donation-based, which has now, some of those videos have been watched over 10,000 times. And it's so powerful to know that resource has been made accessible to anyone who has access to a phone or a computer.
That is incredible.
And I'll keep doing it. I'm still teaching online because the online community became so strong. So I teach live online, and people are literally tuning in from around the world, and we practice together. And finding these ways to close those gaps of accessibility. And some of what you named also is also perceived accessibility or perceived value within one's community. What are you doing going upstairs and getting on your yoga mat, even if it's for 10 minutes, when XYZ needs to be done, or when we don't have time, or we don't have money, or whatever the barrier is?
Yeah. Yoga in particular has that ring of,
Yeah.
or if therapy, actually just private therapy, to be able to afford private therapy, to be, again, culturally, that's okay to talk about your business outside of your
Yes.
home, all of those things. And I agree with you. I'm totally resonating with the delight and the meaning of being able to have the accessibility. This is our whole podcast is about that. Like,
I
so
know.
from all over the world, being able to learn the science that you wouldn't be able to have access to otherwise.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know to.
Yeah. If we hone in on one of the aspects of peritraumatic growth during the pandemic, one thing that happened is that information became profoundly widely available, more than ever before. Things that were maybe in upper echelon academic settings went on to summits that were free, and they're still happening. I have never seen so much free trauma-informed information than these last 2.5 years.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So again, that's that you're recognizing the meaning and you're highlighting that. Let's focus on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What are we putting the lens of our awareness on? And if we're only putting the lens of the awareness on all of the loss and the trauma, and it doesn't mean that we don't want to look at that or attend to that, but if we're only looking and attending to, that's all we see.
So how does mindfulness play into this?
One of my favorite definitions of mindfulness is having choice about where we put our attention, cultivating that capacity. And so I think it really ties into exactly this piece of, where am I putting my attention? Am I only putting my attention on all of these signs of threat? Or do I have the ability to actually make a conscious, mindful shift to look for signs of connection, signs of safety, if that word resonates, or relative safety in the sense of, in this moment, there's no current threat? Okay. Can I look towards signs of empowerment, whatever the resource might be, that I can actually shift the lens of my awareness consciously towards that?
And it is so tricky because, like, I was just thinking of my personal example is how much I want to do my door knocking and go through the neighborhood, you know what I mean? And I've noticed that I have all these big plans and I keep signing up and letting something happen. And my ambivalence is partly like, it's heartbreaking. Like, it hurt to get more engaged and to invest in election or whatever it is. That's a very painful experience. I know that this is true for so many people around, like, really trying to balance that. What can I do? My answer to that is, I would rather later look back and have a heartbreak and be hurting and in it and swinging. And then I also know from a trauma perspective that being active and doing something will typically fare better results. Being in the foxhole and just hoping for the cavalry to come get us. That is a very bad place. Not bad. I don't mean morally bad, but it's a very difficult place on our nervous system versus if we're swinging and we're doing something. And maybe that's being able to get a shower, get outside and get some sunlight in your eyes.
Yeah.
That still counts.
And I can think even about all of these marches that have happened. And there were certain marches that happened early in the pandemic. And I'm like, I'm with the cause, but I don't feel comfortable going out there yet. I'm too early for me with Black Lives Matter and all of that, like those early marches, and or the Women's March even. And I was just like, I don't feel comfortable being in a crowd of people right now. And so knowing that I'm still standing in solidarity with, and that there's other ways to be of value. And I think one of the things that came to mind, Sue, when you were just saying about like that ambivalence, or how do I give or contribute in a way that still feels in alignment with what I feel I can offer right now. Looking at this image of water flowing downhill, it's actually a very powerful force, even though it's following the path of least resistance. But that water eventually can carve canyons and can create great change. So when we're looking at ourselves and how it is that we want to take action, what allows us to actually follow something that feels easy, even though it's still some movement.
It's movement. Yeah. Oh, I love that. That feels really good. It's not, the whole movement isn't on any one particular person.
Exactly.
We're just part of a stream. I really like that. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. I'm going to really high recommend readers to your book.
Thank you.
EMDR Therapy and Somatic. EMDR Therapy and Somatic Psychology, Interventions to Enhance Embodiment in Trauma Treatment. And in case you are watching our new YouTube, there we go. Highly recommend. Really great. It's a couple years old, isn't it?
Yeah, it came out in 2018.
But it's still really, really. And then you've done something since then. Can you tell us?
I have 6 books. I have quite a lot out there. I have the Complex PTSD workbook. And the more recent books, one is the Posttraumatic Growth Guidebook, and that really is relevant, very relevant to everything we're speaking about here today. And then the most recent book is the Therapeutic Yoga for Trauma. And that is the application of polyvagal theory into yoga for trauma treatment. And it's a beautiful book. Dr. Steve Porges wrote the foreword for it, and I'm really happy it's out there.
No, that's really beautiful. All of these will be, of course, linked in our show notes. So if someone's new to this, which of those books would be a good starting place?
I think it depends on what it is that you're looking for. If you are a therapist and you're wanting to know how to integrate EMDR and somatic psychology, the book you held up is a fantastic go-to. I also have the Complex PTSD Treatment Manual written for therapists. And then if you are a layperson listening to this, looking for tools for your own growth and healing, the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook and the Complex PTSD Workbook, if you've grown up with developmental trauma, that workbook is for you. For anyone right now with our pandemic, I think the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook is going to be a nice resource.
Oh, that's wonderful. And then you also had mentioned some of the YouTube and some of the training. Can you tell us how to find that?
Yeah. So it's all on my website, and it should be pretty navigable, if that's a word, on the website. I have a blog. There's lots and lots of information in the blog. And of course, all the books are on there, and the trainings that I teach are on there.
And your website is?
Oh, it's drarielleschwartz.com. So pretty easy.
That is wonderful. All right. Is there anything else you want to say to this incredible audience that tunes into this kind of really, I think, life-changing education?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my heart is just gratitude for everyone who is walking through this world right now, whether you are in a helping profession or whether you are here navigating your own trauma. I think that it's a courageous act to stay involved, and by listening to this podcast, you're actually nourishing your resilience right now. So that's fantastic.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful way to say it. And I think that's true, that as we have other voices coming in and this beautiful hope that you're offering, especially if we don't come from, like me, from a naturally secure history, that in the blank of things and in the isolation, we fill in are just our old stuff.
Yeah.
All of the online resources that bring in voices of healing and hope, things like that, we really do need to get it generated from outside of our own minds. It's how we started, which is that there is help and it is effective, and we just have to reach out for it and let it in and let it work. And yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's beautiful. All right. Thank you. This has been really informative and I know inspiring to so many people, and timely. Could not have been more timely. It's given me a little shot in the arm. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, listeners, and we will see you around the bend.